Well, I'll start with a question. What I was suggesting in my paper is that we should look to the functions served by chiasmus. What's it doing in these texts? And I just focused on the homicide accounts, but I'm hearing a lot today about creation accounts and enthronement accounts and so on. Have you sensed any reason why chiasmus might show up in those kind of accounts in particular? And I don't know. I mean, in the creation story, you've got opposites, heaven and earth, and wet and dry, and light and dark. And you begin with a binary world, and maybe chiasmus helps to make a more three-dimensional order out of what was just beginning in the beginning something binary. Okay, is that thinking just too speculative to be an area that we ought to go into, or is that just the same as what everyone has done with semiotic kind of thinking? Any thoughts?
I would perhaps say it's to do with perhaps things being on the official level, because if I understand what you were saying correctly, it seems to be, you're pointing out it seems to be from the more official level that this chiasm occurred, and the texts we have are from the official records also of groups, whether it's in Israel or in the ancient Near East. So it could be to do with there is formal training behind that. Of course, we don't know about whether it occurred on a less formal level, because we don't have the records of those sort of, the folk tales, unless they become official tales as such. So that could be an answer.
Thank you, Jack, for raising the issue, because I need to say something quite important about the material I presented, which of course didn't have to do with creation and so on. I'll say a word about that in the sidebar. I neglected to mention something which I think is truly very crucial about the three Genesis cycles that I referred to, the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle, and the Joseph story. First, the sidebar comment. In the program, there's a fourth-page handout which is about the primeval history, that is, say, Genesis 1 through 11, which includes creation, the flood, which Steve spoke about, etc. There is no chiastic structure there. The type of structuring, there is a literary structure, but it's parallel. It's from creation to flood, and then from flood to Abraham, which parallel each other if you look at that part. And I suspect that that's, so the overarching structure there is not chiastic. That's just for a sidebar comment, and probably intentional to set off the primeval material before we come to Abraham from the rest of the material in Genesis. But I want to focus on the three focal points on which the three stories that I described, where the access point for those three stories are. The first one, with Abraham, is the covenant with God, as I pointed out. The second one in the Jacob story is Jacob's decision to return to the land of Israel. And the third one is where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, which I think represents the unity of the people of Israel. Those 3 points, right? Covenant between God and Abraham, representing the people of Israel. Jacob's decision to return to the land of Israel, referring to the centrality of that country, of that land. And 3, the unity of the people of Israel after all the fractures between Joseph and his brothers coming together at the beginning of Genesis 45. Those are the 3 crucial points that are at the heart of the Bible of ancient Israel. I don't think it's a coincidence that those 3 points are there, and from there the author has created these chiastic structures which allows you, the reader, the listener to these stories, to focus on those 3 points. That's a very important point, building beyond the aesthetic or whatever else that I was referring to, which brings us to the emphases placed on those axis points or focal points in the 3 Genesis stories. The coda to this is that nowhere does the story itself tell you that. You need to be an interactive reader or listener to these texts, right? The ancient texts require active participation from the reader and not the sort of passive reading that we do typically in the 21st century. So I just wanted to point that out, and thanks for stimulating that thought there, Jack.
referring back to Jack's point, I think we need to be careful when we look at the process of chiasm across cultures, because I don't know if a chiasm has to be functioning the same way it is in Israel as it would be in Central America or in Bali. I just don't know if we need to impose that upon the structure itself. I think the notion that was brought up yesterday of it being related to orality, I think that's absolutely crucial. The idea that it's related to memorization, I think, is clearly there. But in some cultures, such as Central America, I think the idea of balanced poetry is a powerful concept. It's always about balance. I once tried to make some poetic speech to a ritual healer in Chortí, speaking Chortí to them. And I made up my own kind of constituent elements of the chiasm, and they broke into laughter. That was not a good sign, right? And they essentially said that was an infelicitous comparison. You don't put those two together, right? So because they don't balance out well. So it's all about what balances well in the culture, but in my view, in all my experience, I thought that would work well, and it didn't. So I wonder if chiasms might have different weights in different areas, different foci that are perhaps more salient than other places.
Just,
Sorry. Okay,
just
so
returning
I have
to the concept of officialness. Again, if you have a very structured test, like with a chiasm, it sort of locks it. And in the example of May and stuff, it gets locked on stone in time. So it's the official version. And with the Gilgamesh, at the beginning, the scribe is sort of talking about why he's writing down the Gilgamesh story. And it seems because in oral cultures, there will be a natural variation that is allowed to the telling of the story. And it seems like the different versions out there of the Gilgamesh story were just getting too wild and divergent for his official taste. So he's sort of creating an official version there. So it helps sort of lock in a story into a certain way of telling it and telling it. And in terms of, say, laws and stuff, again, it makes it very firm. You can't really, it's hard to change it without creating a new structure or whatever. So if it's part of the memory as well, it becomes official memory, perhaps.
I like what you say about it being locked in. When you think about legislation or about a lot of social innovation, the question always is, well, how long is this going to go on? What will draw this to an end? What closes this process? If you can have new legislation every week from the House of Representatives, well, then we don't know really what the law is, do we? I'm sorry about that, but the idea of having some kind of point in which, as you say, it's locked in, and if you have a literary form that clearly marks that as being complete and closed, maybe that is subconsciously a part of how some of these texts are functioning in an official context, or maybe also in a ritual context where the ritual is now a complete process, in the Holiness Code and other places where we know lots of the passages in Leviticus are chiastic. And that's the complete ritual. You don't have to worry about whether you've done all the parts if you've done this. Just a thought.
Okay, I have several specific questions here, but kind of opening it up perhaps a little more broadly, some interaction between people were noticing the similarities as well as, like Professor Holt mentioned, the differences between New World and Old World. As you were watching each other's presentations, were there things that you noticed, for those of you who are focusing on more Old World, Mesopotamian, Israelite literature, things that you noticed about the Mesoamerican literature that Professor Hull presented, and vice versa, Professor Hull, the things that you noticed in the other presentations that you noticed as being strong resonances or specific differences? Maybe speak to that.
I think when listening to Gary and Scott's talks, and specifically, I thought the idea of thematic chiasms is something that pretty much escapes us in Central America because you have longer texts to deal with, and our texts are generally much shorter. The Tablet of 96 Glyphs, that beautiful one that I showed you, is one of our longer texts, and so you can only have so much of that in terms of themes over various verses and lines when you have a limited number of glyphs recounting the episode. So thematically, I think there's a lot of work that we can do and try to look for that better. So far, I think we've been primarily focused on grammatical structures and words. And I think the idea of focusing more on themes, as I've seen today, might be a productive way of approaching our longest text that we do have.
But just a question on that, Carrie. The Popol Vuh is a longer story. Has anyone looked at whether the overall story should be seen in some kind of structure, whether it's chiastic or anything else?
We should make a chair for Alan to come up here. And Alan, do you want to? Do you have any comment on that?
The entire creation is actually so that's
Okay, he says the wow. Okay, actually, there's a microphone there. If you'd want to repeat that, thanks.
oh. The creation account itself, which takes up about a third or a fourth of the text, is actually arranged as a chiasm. So it gives a very long, detailed account of the stages of creation. And at the very end, it recapitulates it in reverse order in a single paragraph. So yeah, you can arrange large sections of text.
Any other observations from those looking at the Mesoamerican?
This is going to be very minor, and I just couldn't help but notice one of the passages you put up about creation had the word good in the A line, and the A prime line was very good at the end. That's exactly what you have in Genesis 1, where on each day of creation God sees that it is good, but on day 6 at the end of creation he saw that it was very good. And so just part of this, I assume, culmination, summation of the creative activity. Struck me as a cross-cultural parallel, without suggesting any direct influence.
Yeah. There could have been some later influence too, because this is recorded in the 1940s, I think. So there was definitely an opportunity for some overlap.
And I wondered when I noticed the word good there, and also thought of Genesis 1. What does the word good mean in that context? We have two words in Greek for good, agatha and kala. And one is good in a kind of moral sense or some kind of objective sense. Kala, beautiful. Right? Calligraphy is beautiful. So you have something kala. Well, at the end, God says it is kala. It is beautiful. I wonder what are they saying in the Mesoamerican text with that word.
In Lakando, in the text we were looking at, the word was tsoi or netzoi for good. And I think it's closer to the kala meaning in Greek, generally speaking. It's uts and a few other varieties, but it's a general word for good, but it has very often the sense of beautiful inherent in it, much closer to the kala, I believe.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Please join me in giving a hand to our presenters.